There's a country where information is controlled, where borders are sealed, where an entire population lives under one of the most powerful governments on Earth. That country is North Korea. But it didn't start this way. It became this way. Subscribe, because this story doesn't begin with isolation. It begins with division. Before there was a North Korea, there was just Korea. For centuries, the Korean Peninsula existed as a unified culture. Dynasties rose and fell, but the land, the language, and the identity remained connected. That changed in the early 20th century. In 1910, Korea was taken over by Japan. For 35 years, Korea was no longer independent. Its culture was suppressed. Its economy was controlled. Its people were forced to adapt to foreign rule. And when that rule finally ended in 1945, freedom did not come alone. At the end of World War II, the empire that had controlled Korea for decades collapsed almost overnight. Japan surrendered. Its soldiers withdrew. Its authority vanished. For the first time in 35 years, Korea was no longer under foreign rule, but there was no clear plan for what came next. No unified government waiting to take control. No agreed transition. Just a power vacuum, and a peninsula sitting between two rising superpowers. To the south, American forces began moving in. To the north, Soviet troops advanced just as quickly. Neither side was thinking about long-term unity. They were thinking about influence, control, position. And so, in a matter of days, a decision was made, not in Korea, but far away. A line would divide the peninsula. The 38th parallel. It wasn't drawn after long debate. It wasn't negotiated with Korean leaders. It was chosen quickly, almost casually, based on maps and convenience. A way to separate zones of occupation. A way to avoid direct conflict between two global powers. On paper, it was temporary, a short-term solution, a placeholder until a proper government could be formed. But on the ground, it became something else. Soviet forces consolidated control in the north. They supported local communist groups, helped organize political structures aligned with their ideology. In the south, American forces took a different approach. They backed anti-communist leadership, encouraged a separate political system. At first, the division was administrative, different authorities, different policies. But then it began to deepen. Communication between North and South weakened. Movement across the line became restricted. Each side began building its own version of Korea. And with each passing month, the idea of a single, unified country became harder to imagine. Two governments emerged, each claiming legitimacy, each believing they represented the future of the entire peninsula. Two systems took shape, one aligned with Soviet-style communism, the other with Western-backed governance. And what had started as a temporary line, drawn quickly, almost as an afterthought, became something far more permanent. Because once systems form, they don't easily merge. And soon, what had been one country for centuries became two, not just divided by land, but by ideology, leadership, and vision. North Korea and South Korea in the north. As the dust of World War II settled and foreign armies drew their lines across the peninsula, a man began to emerge from the background. His name was Kim Il-sung. At first, he was not the only option. There were other figures, other resistance fighters, other leaders who had opposed Japanese rule. But Kim Il-sung had something the others didn't: support. The Soviet Union didn't just want a leader in the north. It wanted a leader it could shape, someone reliable, someone controllable, someone who could build a system aligned with its interests. Kim fit that role. He had a background as a guerrilla fighter against Japanese forces. That alone gave him credibility. But credibility can be amplified. With Soviet backing came structure, military training, political positioning, resources. He wasn't just introduced to the public. He was presented at rallies and speeches, in carefully crafted appearances. Kim Il-sung was framed as more than a man. He was a hero, a liberator, a figure who had fought for Korea when others could not, and in a country that had just emerged from decades of occupation. That image mattered, because people weren't just looking for leadership. They were looking for meaning, for stability, for someone who could represent a future that felt uncertain. And Kim understood something that would define everything that followed. Power is not secured by force alone. It is secured by belief. So he didn't just build a government. He built a story. In that story, he was always at the center. The man who resisted when others submitted. The man who stood firm when the country was under foreign control. The man who now stood ready to lead. Whether every detail of that story was accurate became less important than how often it was repeated. In speeches, in schools, in newspapers, in songs. The narrative didn't just exist. It surrounded people. And over time, something began to shift. Kim Il-sung was no longer just a political leader. He became a symbol of resistance, of survival, of national identity itself. And once a leader becomes a symbol, questioning them no longer feels like disagreement. It feels like betrayal. That is when power changes form. Because at that point, authority is no longer enforced. It is accepted, reinforced, protected by the very people living under it. And slowly, what began as leadership became something much harder to challenge, authority. Then in 1950, the tension that had been building for years finally snapped. At dawn on June 25th, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, not in small numbers, not as a border clash, but as a full-scale invasion. Tanks rolled forward. Artillery followed. Troops advanced rapidly into the south. The attack was fast, organized, overwhelming. South Korea wasn't ready. Its forces were pushed back almost immediately, collapsing under the speed and scale of the assault. Cities fell one after another, and within days, the situation looked irreversible. But this wasn't going to stay a local war, because as the front lines shifted, the world began to respond. The United States, along with a coalition of allies under the United Nations, entered the war on the side of South Korea. Troops arrived, equipment followed, and the conflict expanded beyond the peninsula. Then came another shift. As UN forces pushed north, nearing the Chinese border, a new player entered the war. The China, not quietly, not symbolically, but in massive numbers. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops crossed into Korea. And just like that, the balance shifted again. What followed was not a clean war. It was brutal, unpredictable, and constantly changing. Front lines moved back and forth across the peninsula. Cities were captured, then recaptured. Territory gained, then lost. Seoul alone changed hands multiple times. Bombing campaigns devastated infrastructure. Entire neighborhoods disappeared. Railways, bridges, factories destroyed. And on the ground, soldiers fought in extreme conditions. Freezing winters, harsh terrain, relentless combat. But the true cost wasn't just military. Civilians were caught in the middle. Millions displaced. Families separated. Lives permanently altered. By the time the fighting slowed, the human cost was staggering. Millions were dead, not just soldiers, but civilians. After 3 years of war, the momentum faded, not because one side had clearly won, but because neither side could. So in 1953, the fighting stopped, not with a peace treaty, not with resolution, but with an armistice, a ceasefire. The guns fell silent. But the conflict did not end. The border remained, still drawn along the 38th parallel, a heavily fortified line, dividing two systems, two governments, two realities, families that had once lived in the same country, now separated by a boundary they could not cross. And technically, the war never ended. No formal peace was ever signed. No final agreement reached. Just a pause, a conflict frozen in place. And that frozen line would shape everything that came next. After the war ended, North Korea was physically shattered. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Infrastructure barely existed. Entire regions had to be rebuilt from the ground up. But reconstruction was not just about roads and buildings. It was about power. Under Kim Il-sung, rebuilding became an opportunity to redesign the country itself, not to restore what had existed before, but to replace it entirely. Political rivals did not simply lose influence. They were removed from the system. Some disappeared from public life. Others were erased more completely. Positions of authority were filled with those whose loyalty was unquestioned, not just to the state, but to Kim himself. And loyalty was not assumed. It was tested, measured, recorded. People were classified, backgrounds examined, family history scrutinized. Trust was not based on what you said, but on who you were connected to. At the same time, alternative ways of thinking were steadily eliminated. Newspapers no longer debated. They repeated. Education did not present competing ideas. It presented a single narrative. History itself was reshaped, events rewritten, roles redefined, and at the center of that narrative was the leader. Kim Il-sung was not just portrayed as a political figure. He became something closer to a permanent presence. His image appeared everywhere. His story was taught as foundational, his decisions framed as necessary. Over time, the line between leadership and identity began to blur. And then came the idea that would hold it all together. Juche. On the surface, it was presented as independence, a country that would rely on no one, a system that would stand on its own. But in practice, it redefined dependence. The state became the center of everything. Economic activity, information, movement, all flowed through it. Trade with the outside world was reduced. External influence limited. Foreign media restricted. Not gradually noticed, but deliberately controlled. Radios were fixed to receive only approved broadcasts. Printed material was monitored. Access to outside information became something rare. And without outside comparison, the internal system became harder to question. Over time, this structure moved beyond politics. It shaped daily life, where people lived, what they could study, what work they were assigned. Even relationships were influenced by classification and status. The system did not rely only on force. It relied on organization, on placing people in defined roles, on limiting movement between them, on ensuring that deviation carried consequences. And because it was consistent, it became predictable. Because it was predictable, it became stable. And because it was stable, it endured. What had begun as post-war reconstruction had turned into something else entirely. Not just a government, not just an ideology, but a structure that reached into nearly every aspect of life and remained there. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, something unusual happened. Power did not shift. It was inherited. His son, Kim Jong-il, took control. North Korea became something rare in modern politics, a hereditary system, not just a government, a dynasty, and the structure remained. Control of media, control of movement, control of information. In the 1990s, North Korea faced one of its greatest challenges: economic collapse, food shortages, famine. Hundreds of thousands, possibly more, died. But the system did not collapse. It adapted. Resources were redirected. Control tightened. And the leadership remained. Today, North Korea is led by Kim Jong-un. The structure built decades ago still exists. The country remains isolated. Its military remains strong. Its nuclear program has become one of the most significant concerns in global politics. And inside its borders, life continues under a system unlike most others in the world. North Korea did not become isolated overnight. It was shaped by division, by war, by leadership, by control, step by step, decision by decision, from a unified land to one of the most closed nations on earth. And this story, it's still unfolding. So if you want to understand how power shapes nations, subscribe, because the next story goes even deeper.